side of the house and no water got into it.
Wow.
Don't bend your head, that's how they do it.
Oh, yeah. That was
If everybody can gather at the back of the truck here, we'll go ahead and talk about the buffalo jump. If you want to hang out and look at anything afterwards, we can do that as well. But I know some people have other engagements to get to. So what we're at to our front, just down this path that Deal and his sons have cut for us, is the Roberts Ranch buffalo jump. So we'll walk down all the way if anybody after the talk. But that way anybody who doesn't feel like walking down there, if you've got somewhere to go, you can go other places. So the Roberts Ranch Buffalo Jump is one of the most noted archaeological sites in Larimer County. There are right now somewhere well over 12,000 archaeological sites registered with the state in Larimer County. This is its designation for the state of Colorado is 5LR, 5 being state of Colorado. It's a Smithsonian system, LR being Larimer County. And this is the 100th site registered in Larimer County. And that was in the 1960s when that system got adopted, late 1960s. So the Roberts Ranch Buffalo Jump was found by DL's father in the 1950s, I believe 57. He was out working on the channel in the North Fork of the Pooter with a bulldozer. Something if DL did today, he'd probably be in jail right now. But in the 1950s, you could do that on your own without the Corps of Engineers. And he noticed a bunch of bison bones washing out of the side of the west side of the Pooter River that's to our front and our south there. And so then he contacted again, tried to find some people to come look at it. That took some time. In the 1960s, a briefing I was just at, there was estimated 7 archaeologists in the state of Colorado in the early 1960s. So not today where you have CRM firms, you have the state archaeologist and things like that. So getting someone to come out and look at it took a while. In the mid-1960s, the Colorado Archaeological Society, which I know we have some members here joining us today, the chapter out of Denver, of course, in 1960, there's not a lot of people in Fort Collins. There wasn't a chapter of the society here then. They came out and did some excavations on it and did find that there were buffalo bison bones there. And so then they contacted CSU, who was just developing their archaeology program in the 1960s, is when we got our first archaeologist and the department was formed. So they came out and did an initial survey in the 1970s, did some trench work in 1969, and then they came back in 1970 and did a complete field school and excavated the buffalo jump. And so I'll pass around. I got about 4 or 5 copies here on the front side. You'll see the kind of the excavations and where each person did each group did their works. And then on the back side, it'll show you where they found the bison bones. And so at the buffalo jump, when they did that in the field school, and coming out of that, a guy named Max Whitkind did a thesis here in 1971, which I highlight because the Roberts family has been a great supporter of archaeology and history in Larimer County in Colorado, going back to his grandparents, but definitely his father. CSU under Liz Morris has ran field schools here. I don't even know the total count, but on and off for 50 years, almost at least every other year, there have been field schools here. As recently as 2018 and our 2017 field schools, we did work here on the ranch. It's one of the most archaeologically rich areas in the county, in Larimer County, and again, has basically, you have from the Folsom period on down to now historic events. You have every era covered here on the ranch, from pit houses to human burials to buffalo jumps. So it is an amazing area, and again, with the ranch being preserved, we're at that same time really preserving the history of man in northern Colorado. The next we'll talk is then in 2010-13, Chris Johnson, who was the former state assistant archaeologist, he's now moved on, was doing his master's at CSU, and he chose the Roberts Ranch Buffalo Jump for his thesis, for his master's thesis, which most of these maps that I'm passing around are from. And so in his work, he went back in and reanalyzed the collections and looked at what was there, and he had basically 3 research questions. What is the faunal artifacts, assemblages at the site. So what was there besides bone? What stone tools, projectile points? What was the composition of the bone assemblages? From that, you can get an estimate of how many bison were there. And then he was trying to look at spatially how those two related to one another in his analysis. And so when Chris went back in the assemblages, what he found was that there were nearly 3,000 bone elements, 3,005 to be precise, 22 points, projectile points, 5 tips of points, 65 stone tools, and 1,904 flakes. So a ton of debitage was there, clearly showing that they were making stone tools and sharpening them at this site. And through his bone analysis, what Chris came up with is that there were, let me make sure I get that, 19 adult or juvenile bison. The vast majority of those were believed to be female bison. And then they were also able to find 8 fetal bison remains in there. And from the ethnography of talking to Native Americans, especially ethnography that was done in the early 20th century and period accounts in the 19th century as settlers moved in, fetal bison was basically considered a delicacy. And so because of the presence and the gestation period, when you put all of that together, you can basically narrow that this was a winter-spring buffalo jump where the bison were killed because of the development of the bison. So somewhere in that period of mid-December to mid-April would have been when the bison were killed at this site. And the reason it's called a buffalo jump is because what would happen on the far side of this, if you drive down Red Feather Lakes Road and look up north as you do that, it's a gentle sloping hill up towards this cliff above the North Fork of the Pooter. If you look at the terrain further south, it channelizes, so it's very easy if you position people in the right spots to channelize the buffalo and scare them up this direction. And once, like any animal, you get it stampeding, moving in the direction you want. So they would do that to the buffalo. In Chris's work and with the local landowners, he was able to identify 14 cairns over about a 350-meter area that were used to synchronize this attack on the buffalo to drive them over that still existed. They would drive the buffalo and they would get them running, and eventually they would just run over the cliff, being scared from the threat behind them, not knowing it's a cliff. They would plummet down to their deaths, and then you would go in and you would, from the amount of projectile points, they obviously had to shoot some of the bison. They would break legs, but wouldn't be killed. I would imagine you wouldn't want to be around a squirming bison after it had broken limbs and ribs. And so they would kill the bison there, and then they would proceed to process them. Let me hand around. This map shows the flaking debris on one side where they found that, and the back side shows kind of where they found the different objects.
Is this something they only did once, or were they doing it every year?
This site, based on the bone analysis and on the amount of bison, was believed only be a single event bison kill. Now, there very well could be other bison. You know, you came down there, you killed in other places along here or anywhere with floods and other things, whatever reason, and when you get out there, just kind of where the river channel went, it was a pocket that trapped it. Normally, you would expect a lot of things if it were along a riverbank, never make it to a depositional. They'll just get washed down. And if you go to eastern Colorado, people find bison skulls, they find the bones, and they find points that are polished that have just been washed down the Pooter and down into the Platte that they find all the way out to Julesburg and into Nebraska that aren't from the local area, that they just get pushed down as part of the natural progression. They have 5 dates from here, and so this buffalo jump is proto-historic, which means it's basically from the 1600s to the 1850 area. And so it's believed to be a date on this was thought to be 1663 to 1684. And it's very remarkable that the radiocarbon dates, when they did the right calibration and everything, came down to such a narrow area. And so you're talking well before the tribes in this area would have had any substantial, if any, contact with Spanish, and definitely not even British or French probably at that point.
But you're not talking about Folsom then?
No, this is, again, this is modern Native Americans in the 1600s.
Do they have horses?
At this point, most of these tribes probably did not have horses at this point. If you go back into the Shoshone and the Comanche, and at the time, we usually associate this area with the Ute, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. Cheyenne and Arapaho would have still been to the east, closer to the Great Lakes, Minnesota. They would have yet to be pushed west by the Sioux. The Sioux would not have crossed the Missouri River yet, at least the majority of the Sioux bands we associate with western Nebraska, eastern Wyoming. So you're probably, and again, it's difficult to say, there is no indication of what Native American tribe this would be. You would have had the Cheyenne, you would have had the Comanche and Apache moving south in that time, somewhere in that time period. The Utes would have been existing in the mountains, so the Shoshone coming into Idaho that direction. There's a lot of fluidity at that time in the Native American tribes. But again, assigning this was a Cheyenne, Arapaho, a Shoshone, there's absolutely no way to do that from the remains that exist there.
You said there were cairns. What are the? Can you explain the use of the cairns?
The cairns are just little stacked stones, just like you see in people do now, what your kids do in small ones, but a little obviously bigger that they would do. They use those at a lot of game drives. If you go into the mountain passes here in Colorado on the Front Range, there's a lot of game drives where they've built small stone walls. It doesn't, the animal when it's just progressing hits the stone wall and then kind of goes another direction. And they would channel them towards blinds, and so they would those use cairns again, kind of signaling each other where things were. So if you're pushing the bison, you know when to turn it to the left so that it comes up and goes off the buffalo jump. I'll also pass around, here's some of the artifacts, because a lot of them are small. It shows the artifacts that were found here. A lot of bone tools. You'll see some awls, scrapers in there. And then here's the stone tools, and there's some on each side of these. So those are some of the tools they made, and those are some of the broken projectile points. Not by, because at this point it's so similar. I mean, you can kind of date notch by the projectile points to certain periods, but to a point where you can say this is this type. Some knives and some things you'll get named. Certain artifacts may be able to be more identified with your 19th century Native Americans because you have a lot more examples and where you have provenance of what it is. But most of this stuff you don't have the ability to say that's a Shoshone or that's a Ute or an Apache or a Cheyenne arrow point. The last thing I'll highlight then is you come and look. It's probably the first time in 50 years this has been back. So in the back of the truck, I won't pass these around. Please don't touch them there. They are somewhat fragile. But the 4 bones on the right are items that were taken from the buffalo jump during the field school in 1969 and 70. 2 of the bones, some of the vertebrae, again, you can see it's a kill site. They were articulated, so they actually fixed them back together. When they did that, this I believe is a pelvis, and then a buffalo skull. The skull may not be from this site, but it is period of what it would have been, what it would have looked like. I also have, if anybody's interested, the best I can do is on the video here. It's kind of dark, but hopefully it'll show. And I can play it a couple times. It's a drone footage we took at this field school a couple years ago, and actually shows kind of what the approach would have been for the buffalo coming across the buffalo jump and falling into the river as the drone did. With that, then we can go ahead and walk up to the site, and I can answer any questions that my limited knowledge has the ability to do.
Anybody is welcome to walk out to the river there and buffalo jump site to see it. When you do leave, because people just leave, not as a group, I'm sure. Dio want me to mention that the bathrooms in the stuccoed house that you just went through are available for use.
They're not.
In the wood frame house.
The one in the main bathroom is not working.
It's not working?
No.
Okay.
Sharon, did you test it?
No, but somebody did.
Oh, so one of them's not working. When you do leave down the road, the other thing to get out to 287 at the fork in the road, rather than going right past DL's house, where we just came up, go take the left at the fork, go over the cattle grate. That'll take you right out to 287, so you can easily make a right turn on 287 if you're headed south.
Looking out there.